Hello, I'm Dr. Patrick Mulroe. Firstly, I'd like to thank Damien and Finn for including me in the programme of speakers today for what promises to be a very innovative event. I'm going to speak about the Sunningdale government, or what's known as the Sunningdale government, which took office from the 1st of January 1974 until the 28th of May 1974. Now, I just want to get one key point across during the overall presentation. Looking at some of the resources available for Leaving Cert students and looking at some of the textbooks, I think it's important just to be clear that prior to the Sunningdale Conference in December 1973, the British government had already legislated for how Northern Ireland would be governed under the 1973 Constitution Act. Okay, so that act legislated for power sharing, it legislated for cross-border cooperation. By the time we get to the Sunningdale Conference in December 1973, we're discussing issues like the Council of Ireland. We're discussing issues like Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution. We're discussing issues of cross-border security. The mechanics of who was going to get what role in the executive had already been established. Now, Brendan O'Leary is a very well-respected academic, and he's written 3 volumes of text on the history of Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland conflict. Now, in volume 3, he addresses the power sharing that took place in Northern Ireland from the 1st of January 1974. He speaks about the Constitution Act, and he's worth quoting. The new Constitution was drafted in London by Westminster government and its officials. The text was not negotiated by political parties, let alone ratified by their publics. This constitution was very obviously British. The imperial government drafted a constitution for the benighted inhabitants of the not-so-former colony. But there was a major novelty. In a distinct shift from custom, it was recognised that Northern Ireland could not be successfully governed under a miniature version of the Westminster model. Okay, so it's a very, very important observation from Brendan O'Leary, and it's one that often gets lost. We're very used to the phrase that the Good Friday Agreement was Sunningdale for slow learners. It was a brilliant quip from Seamus Mallon, but not completely accurate, as we'll see as the presentation goes on. Now, the conference at Sunningdale in December 1973 was looking at the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. And for the first time, it was bringing together the British government, the Irish government, and the government in Northern Ireland. For the first time since the 1920s, I should say. So it's important to go back to that stage and see what exactly was the constitutional status of Northern Ireland as seen by the British government and the Irish government. And as a starting point, we begin with the Government of Ireland Act 1920. So we remember that Northern Ireland's existence predated the Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921. That's a mistake that's frequently made, and we have to emphasise that the Government of Ireland Act 1920 created Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Parliament. The Northern Ireland Parliament was officially opened before we even had the Truce of July 1921. So it's a key point. An important piece of legislation that was passed in the British Parliament with very little support from either Unionist or Nationalist deputies. That act legislated for Parliaments North and South, as we say. Voting for those parliaments was to be done by proportional representation by a single transferable vote. Now that was done to protect minorities. However, when Northern Ireland was established later in the 1920s, the Northern Ireland government got rid of that provision and used the first past the post voting system, which gave less protection to minorities. Now, for Sunningdale, it's also key just to note this third point about the Government of Ireland Act. There was supposed to be cross-border cooperation between Northern and Southern Ireland under the Government of Ireland Act as part of the Council of Ireland. Okay? So as far back as 1920, we had this idea of a Council of Ireland. If we go then to the December 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty, it again included provisions for a Council of Ireland, this time for cooperation between Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State. So this idea of a Council of Ireland is going to be very important to the Sunningdale discussions. The Boundary Commission, as we know, was a key part of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. However, the Boundary Commission report was suppressed in 1925 and never implemented, and at that time the provisions for the Council of Ireland were also dumped. So, key point just to be aware of is that we've had this idea of a Council of Ireland lingering in the background of Anglo-Irish relations right from the foundation of Northern Ireland. It's also worth looking at the constitutional status of Northern Ireland as viewed by the Dublin government. Now, the 1937 constitution had an emotive resonance with nationalists in Northern Ireland, as well as nationalist population in the 26 counties, particularly Article 2. It stated that the national territory consists of the whole island of Ireland, its islands and territorial seas. So for Unionists, this was seen as a very divisive provision in the Constitution. This was the Southern government claiming ownership of Northern Ireland. And it was seen as highly problematic. And again, this is something we need to be aware of as we approach Sunningdale. Before discussing Sunningdale itself, it's worth just going through a quick chronology of the first few years of the Troubles. As we know, it began with street disturbances mainly in urban centres like Belfast, Derry, to a lesser extent places like Dungannon, Armagh, Coal Island. The IRA was not the functioning entity it would later become in 1969 and 1970. It reorganised in 1970-71 and began slowly to increase the number of attacks it would carry out on the British security forces. August 1971, internment was introduced. Brian Faulkner was the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, the Premier at the time. He was the leader of the Unionist Party, and he was someone nationalists closely identified with the decision to introduce internment, and he is going to be a key figure within Sunningdale. Now, in response to the introduction of internment, nationalists responded in several different ways. Constitutional nationalists like the SDLP, supported by the Irish government, engaged in a campaign of civil disobedience. One of the things they did was encourage tenants of council properties not to pay their rent and not to pay their local authority rates. It was called the Rent and Rate Strike. So this is going to be important for Sunningdale too. We have the SDLP, the moderate nationalists, encouraging other nationalists to engage in a campaign of civil disobedience in response to the introduction of internment. The situation escalated from there on. January 1972, we have Bloody Sunday, where we have 13 civilians killed by British soldiers, with another person dying in subsequent months. By March 1972, the situation had got out of control. The British Prime Minister, Edward Heath, called in Brian Faulkner and said he was taking security powers away from the Northern Ireland government. In response, Brian Faulkner and the rest of his government resigned, and the British government prorogued or suspended the Northern Ireland Parliament. June 1972, the British government explored talks with Republicans. Now, this move was very unpopular with Unionists, but, and significantly, it was unpopular with the Irish government. The Irish government was fearful that the British would negotiate a side deal with the IRA, and this was something that would be significant in the aftermath of Sunningdale. There was a constant fear on the part of the Irish government that the British and the IRA would negotiate some side deal without Irish government involvement. Those talks broke down and a short-lived IRA ceasefire ended. Then we have one of the most infamous events of the Troubles, Bloody Friday. The IRA detonated 26 car bombs in Belfast, killing 11, and there was widespread revulsion. After this, the Conservative government cut off all contact with the IRA, and the secret talks involving the IRA ended. And this was a significant change in British strategy. They were no longer trying to bring the extremes, as they saw it, into the political dialogue. They were going to, from now on, try and work on the middle ground. And that's where Sunningdale was working on, to get the moderate nationalists and moderate unionists working together in government. Or in the aftermath, of Bloody Friday, the British government used the opportunity to get rid of what were called no-go areas within nationalist enclaves in Belfast and Derry. So in other words, these were areas where nationalists had erected barriers and would not allow in the security forces. The consequence of internment and Operation Motorman was that Republicans who were previously hiding out in these no-go areas needed to go somewhere else. One of the places that they went was border areas, and we have a spread of violence to border areas and increased border violence in 1971-1972. And this is in the background as we approach Sunningdale. We have the IRA's presence south of the border becoming a more significant factor. So what the British government and the Unionists really wanted out of Sunningdale was increased cooperation from the Irish government to deal with the IRA threat that was coming from across the border. So that change in the pattern of violence is very significant as we approach Sunningdale. Now, to give an indication of the levels of violence in Northern Ireland at the time, we could see the list of fatalities by year. That comes from a book called Lost Lives, and I'd recommend that you take a look at it sometime. It gives the details of every individual who was killed in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Now, relations between the British government and the Irish government were pretty bad up to probably mid-1972 or late 1972. And just to give a flavour of how bad these were, they exchanged telegrams publicly. So in other words, they published telegrams that were sent between each other. Today it would be the equivalent of two governments tweeting at each other. It's something you couldn't really imagine. So after the introduction of internment, Jack Lynch, who was Irish Taoiseach, sent a telegram to Ted Heath, British Prime Minister, and it said, "In the event of the continuation of existing policies of attempting military solutions, I intend to support the policy of passive resistance now being pursued by the non-unionist population." So that's the likes of this rent and rate strike. Heath replied, "Your telegram today is unjustified in its content, unacceptable in its attempt to interfere in the affairs of the United Kingdom, and can in no way contribute to the solution of the Northern Ireland problem." So in other words, he was telling Jack Lynch to keep his nose out of things that didn't matter to him. Now, so where did this power-sharing regime, the Sunningdale government, come from? Well, the British government began, after the failed IRA talks, to try and build a consensus among the middle ground. So they hosted talks in Darlington in the latter half of 1972. The SDLP boycotted these talks because of internment. Remember, internment mostly targeted the nationalist population. 2,060 nationalists were interned, put in prison without trial, whereas only 109 loyalists were. Most of the loyalists were interned in the later years of the internment process. So the British government gathered these talks at Darlington. At the talks were the Unionists and the Alliance Party, Middle Ground Party. The British government used these talks plus an SDLP policy document and their own thoughts to come up with what was called a discussion document, or a green paper. Green paper is popular parlance within British political establishment for discussion documents. So the green paper brought together all the ideas for the future of Northern Ireland. So one of the options was Irish unity, and the British government decided to knock that off the table straight away as an option, so they had a border poll. Basically a referendum on whether or not Northern Ireland should reunite with the South. Nationalists of both the Republican and moderate SDLP viewpoint boycotted this referendum, and there was an overwhelming majority in favour of retaining the Union, as would be expected. So in the aftermath of this, the British government produced a white paper. In other words, a white paper being a discussion or a policy document rather than a discussion document. So this was now British policy on Northern Ireland, a white paper. And they turned that policy into law in the Northern Ireland Constitution Act of 1973. So this is really important because all this is done before the Sunningdale Conference. So what did the Northern Ireland Constitution Act say? Well, there are a number of very important provisions. Firstly, it legislated for power sharing, right? The White Paper was explicit about power sharing. The legislation said that a Northern Ireland executive can be formed which is likely to be accepted throughout the community. It also provided for what the White Paper would have termed an Irish dimension. In other words, North-South cooperation. So Article 12 said that the Northern Ireland executive could cooperate with the South, basically as it saw fit. Now, significantly, the Constitution Act also provided the return of proportional representation by a single transferable vote. And it did take other steps to try and prevent discrimination, just as the Government of Ireland Act did in 1920. So, after the publication of the White Paper, there were elections to decide who would go into this new Northern Ireland Assembly. Some Unionists were in favour of the White Paper, some were against, and then there were two other Unionist groupings, Vanguard and the DUP. Some in Vanguard favoured Northern Ireland independence, whereas the DUP, the party of Ian Paisley, favoured Northern Ireland being integrated into the United Kingdom. In other words, no local assembly, but Northern Ireland to be treated, in Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase, to be as British as Finchley. The SDLP were the largest nationalist grouping, winning 19 seats. So together, a combination of the pro-White Paper UUP, the Alliance and the SDLP had sufficient numbers to form a majority of the Assembly and to form a government. Now, after significant negotiations between these parties, an agreement was reached to form an executive among them. Now, what is significant is that in terms of votes in the Assembly, the SDLP and the Alliance had more seats, whereas the Unionists were the smaller grouping. But on the executive, the Unionists had 6 seats, the SDLP 4, and the Alliance 1. So sometimes it's argued that Sunningdale, the Unionists, did terribly badly out of it. But if we look at the formation of the executive, even though Unionists were a minority on the executive in terms of party support, they still enjoyed a majority of seats at the executive. Now, there was a conference to be penciled in for December the 6th to the 9th to decide the outstanding issues that weren't covered by the Constitution Act. Now, this was a statement on the status of Northern Ireland. Obviously, the UK Constitution Act couldn't legislate for getting rid of Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution. So this had to be addressed at Sunningdale. Cross-border security. Again, the UK Constitution Act couldn't deal with that because it required the Irish government's consent. The Council of Ireland, as we've seen, the Constitution Act left it down to the executive as to what they wanted to cooperate on in terms of the Council of Ireland. Finally, internment. A big issue for the SDLP. What would happen to those individuals who were put in jail without trial? This was all to be dealt with at the conference in Sunningdale. So, what we get out of Sunningdale is not an agreement, an international recognised agreement. It's a communique. Because Sunningdale was only the first stage in what was supposed to be a 2-step process. The second step was supposed to be a second conference where all the details would be agreed and a full agreement would be ratified and then sent to the UN where it would be registered. However, there was broad agreement in a few areas at Sunningdale. In terms of internment, the conference took note in its communique of an affirmation by the British government of their firm commitment to bring detention to an end in Northern Ireland for all sections of the community as soon as the security situation permits. Now, there was a specific agreement to let out some internees for Christmas 1973. The SDLP provided a list to the British government of those individuals they thought would be most positive in terms of peace building if they were released, but the British government released other individuals. So there was no specific commitment in terms of a timeline for when internment would end. The next thing the Communique addressed was Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution. The Irish government had said at Sunningdale to both the British and the Unionists that they were not confident that they could change Articles 2 and 3. It would require a referendum, and they weren't sure if the public would support that referendum. In other words, to get rid of Articles 2 and 3. So a compromise was agreed whereby a statement was made. And the key line here is in the first couple of sentences. The Irish government fully accepted and solemnly declared that there could be no change in the status of Northern Ireland until a majority of the people in Northern Ireland decided a change in that status. So this was read out by Liam Cosgrave, Irish Taoiseach, after the Sunningdale conference. So this was the statement, and remember, there was supposed to be a second conference where this statement would be put into a treaty, and the treaty would eventually be ratified at the UN. We never got the second conference, because as we'll see, the Sunningdale institutions collapsed. Now, this proved a problematic area. It was something that should have really supported Brian Faulkner, the leader of unionism, in selling the Sunningdale deal. However, there was a case taken to the Irish courts by a former Fianna Fáil minister called Kevin Boland, a man whose views were quite Republican. Boland said that this statement went against Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution. Now, the case dragged on from January through to March 1974. And when the case was dragging on, the Irish government could not comment on this statement about the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. This prevented them providing much needed support to Brian Faulkner, who at that stage was the unionist leader, under significant pressure. The next thing that was agreed in the communique was measures to tackle cross-border security. Remember, we have IRA members based in the south who, according to unionists and the British government, are using the south as a base to then attract British Army, loyalists and the RUC in Northern Ireland. The British wanted the Irish government to extradite Republican suspects, in other words, the Gardaí to hand over Republican suspects to the RUC. The Irish government again pointed to the Constitution and said the Irish Constitution stipulated that the Irish state respects international law. The argument the Irish government put forward was, if you hand over someone from the IRA to the Northern Security Forces, they're being handed over for a political offence, and that would breach international law. They said they couldn't get a referendum passed on this either. So the compromise arrangement was that they'd come up with some sort of system whereby if you committed a crime in Northern Ireland or committed an offence in Northern Ireland, you could be charged for that offence in the south. But this was going to require some legal experts to spend a bit of time working out how this would happen. So it was put forward that a committee would consider these proposals and recommend some sort of measures that could take place. Now, the Council of Ireland was something that nationalists really wanted. For Brian Faulkner, who was a unionist leader, he didn't think there was much to it. He recalled in his biography that the Council of Ireland was a nonsense, but a necessary nonsense to help the SDLP and its supporters. Remember, the SDLP was entering government with Faulkner. Faulkner had been identified with internment, so it wasn't easy for the SDLP. Faulkner felt that unionists, being practical people, would judge our agreement on practical rather than symbolic levels. So Faulkner's view was there was nothing to this Council of Ireland thing. Of course, the SDLP had to sell it differently. They had to say that this was a significant gain for nationalists. Probably most famously, Hugh Logue, who was an assembly member of the SDLP, said that the Council of Ireland would be a vehicle that would trundle us into a united Ireland. And this was a line that was repeated again and again by opponents of Sunningdale, that the Council of Ireland would lead to Irish unity. Maurice Hayes, who was a senior civil servant, said the unfortunate thing was that after Sunningdale, different people interpreted the Council of Ireland differently. Brian Faulkner came back from Sunningdale and said, this was our bulwark for the Unionist people, our bulwark against being sucked into United Ireland. Then Hugh Logue came out and said, this is the vehicle that will trundle us into United Ireland. You know the sad thing about it? The Catholics believed Faulkner and the Loyalists believed Hugh Logue. So in other words, all the Loyalists thought there's a United Ireland on the horizon and panicked. All the Nationalists, or well, certainly some Nationalists, may have thought there's not much new in this for us. Okay? So, after Sunningdale, the executive was actually established. So we'll talk about its time in office before its collapse. And it came into office on the 1st of January 1974. And if you read the accounts of people like Maurice Hayes, who was the senior civil servant we mentioned earlier, or Paddy Devlin, who was a minister, or Brian Faulkner, of the Sunningdale Agreement, they generally say that it worked well as an organisation. The internal dynamics worked well. They produced some progressive policies in areas like housing. They had what would be generally seen as a slightly left-of-centre policy document called Step Towards a Better Tomorrow that was agreed by the entire executive. It was generally popular in opinion polls. So there was one done in March-April 1974 where 66% of Protestants approved or strongly approved of power sharing, and 59% of Protestants thought the executive should be given a chance. So opinion poll evidence said that even among the Protestant community, Sunningdale was reasonably popular. But there were big problems in terms of security and internment. Internment wasn't ending, as nationalists wanted, while the security situation was deteriorating. Now, the Sunningdale executive had got no powers in terms of the police or army, so they hadn't got security powers, yet people were holding them responsible for the rising violence. And this was undermining public confidence in the Sunningdale Agreement. So they were in a very difficult position. And that difficulty became apparent fairly early. On January the 7th, Brian Faulkner had to resign as leader of the UUP. He stayed on as CEO of the executive, but after a meeting of the Ulster Unionist Council, which included members of Vanguard and the Orange Order, there was a vote lost on ratifying Sunningdale, so Faulkner felt he had to step down. And then came in February a major problem for the new executive. The British government called a general election. Now this was to be elected for seats in the Westminster Parliament rather than the Northern Ireland Parliament. The anti-Sunningdale Unionists ran on a common platform with a memorable slogan, Dublin is just a Sunningdale away. The election was held on the 28th of February 1974 and anti-Sunningdale Unionists won 11 of the 12 seats. It was a resounding victory. To make matters worse, Edward Heath, who was the British Prime Minister, who would have championed the Sunningdale Agreement, championed the Constitution Act of 1973, was no longer Prime Minister. He was replaced by Harold Wilson. His commitment to Northern Ireland was less. Particularly problematic was the appointment of Merlin Rees as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. The problem with Rees was he was an indecisive individual, and generally, and specifically when the crisis came in Northern Ireland in May of 1974, he proved to be particularly indecisive, and that created real problems for the executive. So Maurice Hayes again, he said, I think the February election was the key thing, where it became a referendum virtually on Sunningdale, and with a straight first past the post thing, there was no question in terms of parliamentary representation, a sense the people had spoken, and it was going to be extremely difficult. And Hayes goes on to talk about the problems of rising violence. So we've got the unpopularity of the deal at elections, and then we've also got the rising violence. It all came to a head on May the 15th, 1974. There was a vote in the Assembly on whether the majority of the Assembly still supported Sunningdale or not. And the majority of representatives in the Assembly still supported the agreement. But the majority of Unionists did not. The Ulster Workers' Council, which was an amalgamation of unionist politicians, some low-level trade unionists and paramilitaries, called a strike demanding fresh elections to the Assembly. Now, Glenn Barr was one of the leaders of the UWC strike, and basically what these individuals did was they went out and blocked roads, prevented people going to work. In the first days of the strike, not many responded. It was pretty unsuccessful. But in subsequent days, the paramilitaries got involved. So you can imagine you're driving to work and you come to a roadblock, and there's 3 or 4 individuals there who you are aware of are involved in loyalist paramilitary organisations. You'd probably turn around and you'd not go to work, and that's what happened to a lot of individuals. They didn't go to work. Now, you would probably suspect that the police would intervene and stop the paramilitaries blocking the road. Well, they didn't. Occasionally, the British Army would intervene and they would move the barricade away, and the loyalists would comply and they'd just move away, and then they'd set up another barricade round the corner. So imagine yourself, if you were going to try to drive to work, would you risk going through a loyalist checkpoint driving to work on a normal day? Imagine you were in a workplace and a loyalist paramilitary came around and told everybody to go on strike. Would you continue to work? So this is Glenn Barr speaking some years later. The only people who could have made an impact would have been the RUC. It surprised me they didn't take that decision, in other words, for the RUC to go in and clear the barricades. But as for the British Army were concerned, they were all told, in other words, those at the barricades were told, if the army comes in, let them knock down your barricade, go round the corner and build another one. And that's what they did. So the strike started slowly, but by the second week, Northern Ireland was coming to a standstill. Particularly significantly, the power stations, which had a loyalist element within 2 out of the 3 power stations, and they were cutting power supply. And it was getting to the stage by the last days of May 1974 that it looked like the power supply might be cut to the extent that you could have raw sewage leaking on the streets in Belfast.
So, we have these loyalists blocking roads, and I've understated the seriousness of the loyalist actions. We have to also remember these loyalists who were protesting at the street corners were backed by serious paramilitaries. And there's no greater illustration of that than the events that happened on the 17th of May when the bombs were exploded by loyalist paramilitaries in Dublin and Monaghan, killing 34 people. The failure of the British government to address the actions of paramilitaries really, disappointed isn't a strong enough word, disillusioned both the executive in Northern Ireland, the power sharing executive, and the Irish government. Garret Fitzgerald, in his autobiography, says the morale of the executive, both unionist and nationalist, was shattered by what they saw as the betrayal by the British government that seemed to them and seemed to us be fearful of its own army. Years later, a member of the British cabinet confirmed to me that fear of the army failing to carry out orders was a significant factor in the way the events turned out. Brenton O'Leary, in his treatise on Northern Ireland, compares it to the Curragh Mutiny at the start of the 20th century. This fear that the British Army would not take on the loyalists, that didn't want to fight a war on 2 fronts. So we have this going on in the background. Eventually, the executive collapsed on May the 28th, 1974, in the face of all this unionist opposition. Now, we're getting towards the end here, and just to summarise why the executive collapsed, Noel Dore, who was a diplomat working for the Irish government at the time, presents 6 reasons. We've got 5 listed here, but he provided 6 reasons as to why Sunningdale failed. Firstly, he says the lack of a written deal. It left things vague. Remember, we never got the second conference, whereby we had a formal treaty that was ratified. Like we had with the Good Friday Agreement, a document that was sent to every house in the country. We had a communique with Sunningdale. That was a problem. Okay? Secondly, the timing of the election could not have been worse for the executive. They had only just come into office. Remember, we had the Boland case running in the background, so the Irish government was restricted in what it could say. Remember, that anti-Sunningdale Unionists won 11 out of the 12 seats. Thirdly, the new British government. We had a British government that came into office that had not been the instigators of either the Sunningdale Conference or the Constitution Act. It was not their baby. They were not as committed to the process. We also had a new Secretary of State, Mervyn Rees, who was known to be indecisive, but proved himself particularly indecisive at key moments during that Ulster Workers' Council strike in May 1974. We have the Boland case. Dorr points out, firstly, there was the delay due to the Boland case. In other words, the government could not comment on it. Secondly, the legal defence used by the Dublin government undermined the unionist position. Finally, we have the paramilitary violence. We've mentioned already the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. There was ongoing IRA violence at the border too, right? The more visible violence at street corners was the loyalist paramilitaries. And we've noted already what Garret Fitzgerald said about the failure to address that violence. We have the Ulster Workers' Council itself, which contained open paramilitary people sharing platforms, sharing decision-making functions with elected politicians. Okay, the failure to take on the paramilitaries was a significant reason for the failing of Sunningdale. So, very quickly looking at the legacy of Sunningdale. Was the Good Friday Agreement Sunningdale for slow learners? Certainly there's similarities between the two deals. There was a so-called Irish dimension in both Sunningdale and the Good Friday Agreement. What we mean by the Irish dimension is a role for the Irish government. There would no longer be telegrams telling Irish Taoiseach to mind their own business on matters relating to Northern Ireland. We'd been building towards that from the Anglo-Irish Agreement and the Downing Street Declaration right up to the Good Friday Agreement. We also have power sharing being the basis of the Good Friday Agreement and the principle of consent. So there certainly are institutional similarities. However, I would make three distinct differences between the Good Friday Agreement and Sunningdale. Firstly, Sunningdale was a political agreement. The Good Friday Agreement was a peace agreement. The Good Friday Agreement dealt with issues like demilitarising Northern Ireland, decommissioning paramilitary weapons. It dealt in much more detail with policing. It dealt in much more detail with prisoner and prisoner releases, much more specific than the Sunningdale Communique did. So the first difference I would make is the difference between a political agreement and a peace agreement. The second significant difference, I would argue, is that of the process. The process that led to the Good Friday Agreement, from the Hume Adams talk through the Downing Street Declaration and so on, involved all parties talking through the issues. And if you think of the immediate build-up to the Good Friday Agreement, it was negotiations between all the parties. They produced a finished document, unlike Sunningdale. That document was then put to referendum to the people, again, unlike Sunningdale. Very different situation. So the first difference is political agreement versus peace agreement. Then we've got the process leading to the agreement. And finally, we've got those involved. And this is really, really significant, I think. Sunningdale was about bringing the moderates together and isolating the extremes. The aim that the British government would have been to defeat the IRA. And at the same time in 1974, the IRA was looking to defeat the British government. When we get to the Downing Street Declaration and later the Good Friday Agreement, both the British government and the IRA accept that there's a stalemate. So when we get to the Good Friday Agreement, that was a peace process with the aim of bringing in the paramilitaries into the political process. That certainly was not the aim at Sunningdale. So I would definitely make that distinction between Sunningdale and the Good Friday Agreement, although I suspect any essay on the topic will include reference to Seamus Mallon's famous quip that Sunningdale
was the Good Friday Agreement for slow learners. Two final points on the legacy of Sunningdale. In the immediate aftermath of the failure of Sunningdale, the British government wanted to disengage from Northern Ireland. It engaged in talks with the IRA, which led to a ceasefire. The Irish government certainly suspected that Britain was considering a withdrawal from Northern Ireland, and this really panicked the government in Dublin. They were afraid that they would be left deal with what they thought would be a civil war type situation in Northern Ireland, and the British government would go home. And this caused a lot of concern in Dublin politically. However, that never materialised. But increasingly, the British government adopted a strategy to try and disengage from Northern Ireland. And their security strategy became known as Ulsterisation, where they tried to place most of the security responsibility on local security forces in the form of the RUC and the Ulster Defence Regiment. Similarly, in the aftermath of Sunningdale, and particularly the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, which we only spoke about briefly, there was disengagement from the south. The Dublin government wanted to remain removed from the conflict as much as it could. So one of the real legacies of Sunningdale was a frustration on behalf of the governments in Dublin and London with the whole Northern Ireland problem. And this is why I think it's very dangerous to think of history in linear terms, where we go straight from the failure at Sunningdale on to the Anglo-Irish Agreement, on to the Downing Street Declaration deal, where everything seems to fit into a nice pattern and, we've learned from the failures of past and so on. There was a lot of things happened in between, and just be very, very conscious of that. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'm really looking forward to any questions you have on the topic.